So I think I'll get started here.
Let me go ahead and introduce you guys. So hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is David Yeager. I am an associate professor of psychology here at UT, and I am thrilled to introduce, and I'm the director, I guess, of the Texas Mindset Initiative, which is what you all are attending. You're attending a talk for that speaker series. This is a speaker series that tries to bring to our campus leaders in the latest empirical work focusing on reducing disparities in STEM settings and also in higher education in general. And as a way to educate our community here at UT and the entire Texas system to inform us. And we're lucky that for the first time, we have UT's own experts to speak to us about an innovative new study. This work I'm so excited about and really addresses some key limitations in the field. And I'm also just so proud of how this work that they're going to present exemplifies a real partnership between basic social science research and disciplinary teaching. And so it is an honor and a pleasure to introduce Eric Smith, who is a postdoctoral fellow and received his at UT, received his PhD from Stanford University, and Stacy Sparks, who is one of our leading chemistry instructors here at UT Austin. So Eric and Stacy, take it away.
Thank you, David. Yeah, so really excited to be here to talk about this work. Again, I'm Eric Smith. I'm a social psychologist in the Population Research Center here at UT. And I've been really interested and have devoted most of my research to really discovering and testing ways that instructors can support students, and particularly in inclusive practice that can reduce disparities in college. And today, along with my collaborator, Stacy Sparks, as Dave mentioned, a chemistry professor, instructor here at UT, we'll really be presenting today on how we attempted to leverage undergraduate learning assistants to promote STEM equity. And I should note that I won't be monitoring the chat during the talk, but feel free to put any comments or questions and we can get to them at the end when we have some time for questions then. And Stacy and I initially got connected when she was a TxMI fellow, thinking through how to better support her students. And our collaboration was really focused on reducing the large persistent disparities we see in STEM retention at many universities around the country, including UT Austin. So to orient you to the graph here, this is a decade's worth of major declaration data from the College of Natural Sciences, or CNS, at UT Austin. The x-axis is the term since students began college, and the y-axis is the proportion of students who kept their initial CNS major that they declared. Now, although some change of majors is expected and likely quite adaptive as students explore their interests and figure out what they're passionate about, disparities in retention are not. And what we see is that white and Asian American students, and I should note that you can't actually see the line for Asian American students because it's almost directly overlapping with the line for white students. But these students have a higher chance of keeping their CNS major than Black, Hispanic, and Native American peers. And this is controlling for prior test scores. We already know there are huge disparities in who makes it in the College of Natural Sciences at UT. And this is already selecting for those who could be really successful in any field they devote themselves to. Yet still, by the end of the fourth year, we're seeing difference about 10% in retention based on race ethnicity. And these kind of findings suggest that these disparities really are rooted in experiences during college and in classrooms that threaten belonging and inclusion. And based on findings in social psychology, we know that these experiences can undermine STEM progress through what we call recursive processes. And what I mean by that is that when students confront a difficult assignment or do poorly on a test, they might ask, is this hard because I don't belong here or don't have the ability to succeed here? And how these types of questions are answered really matter and can start these subtle processes that impact students' academic success. They might refrain from studying from others or going to course office hours or seeking out challenging material, all because of this concern that failure in these activities or being outed as an outsider would make them seem like incapable to succeed in that setting. And these small behaviors can impact performance in important ways. They could feed in this cycle of students feeling that they really can't belong or can't do it. And there's decades of work showing that these concerns matter and that students who are underrepresented, structurally under-resourced, or marginalized in a particular setting might benefit most when they're provided messages that address these questions. But this cycle is also an opportunity for educators. We might be able to do things that can start to shift this cycle, and in doing so, raise retention rates, course grades, and feelings of belonging for all students, but also narrow the gaps between groups of students. Yet I think for most of us, our first tendency is to provide more support and resources to students. When we see them struggling, we hold more office hours or recommend academic resource centers, which seem promising because they're targeting the things that students seem to need. But I've intentionally put this in gray because students need to have these underlying questions addressed to use these programs. So we might extend our office hours, but if I'm a student struggling in the course and worried how people will view me, am I going to go those office hours to ask my seemingly stupid question? Maybe not. And these types of supports have really been the dominant approach in higher education for decades. And yet we are still finding these disparities. Moreover, some experimental studies on these types of supports have really found underwhelming effects. So what about interventions that shift these fundamental concerns? First, as many of you are familiar with, are direct-to-student interventions. These interventions attempt to show students that belonging concerns are common and transitory, that their intelligence and ability can grow with time and effort. And these are definitely promising interventions, yet a lot of recent studies are increasingly finding that their effectiveness depends on the classroom culture and climate for them to really take hold and impact students. So the next logical step would be changing classroom instruction, and in doing so, changing classroom cultures. Researchers and instructors have identified promising practices that could be effective, but they haven't yet been systematically tested in a way that gives us confidence they can be effective at scale. So why, as researchers, have we avoided rigorously testing these classroom practices? I'm going to suggest that it's because of 3 unanswered questions. First, how can we actually motivate instructors to change their practices? After all, instructors have many demands on their time. It's challenging to make wholesale changes to our habits and routines once they're established. So how do we actually get them to kind of get out of those routines and do something new and try something new? The second is, how can we get instructors to use high impact practices with fidelity? The research on teaching and learning and psychology has hundreds, if not thousands, of potential practices that instructors could put in place. And it's really challenging to sort all the possibilities of what you could do and choose the ones that could be effective in your classroom and implement in a way that's kind of authentic to your teaching style in your classroom. And these first 2 challenges are really just about having one instructor changing practices. How can we motivate them and get them to kind of develop high impact practices within their particular context? But then if we really want to test this out, how do we actually get a large enough sample of instructors, some of whom might need to be randomized to a control or comparison group, and really test these using experimental methods and see kind of evidence whether these practices might be impacting students' experiences. So in this talk, we really present a potential answer to all these questions, which is we developed a fellowship for undergraduate learning assistants who are students who had previously taken the course and are now coming back as part of the teaching team, and taught them a simplified framework of research-based practices that they could use within their discussion sections. And I'll unpack everything about what that means and throughout the talk. But first, just going to be an overview of where we're going today. First, Stacy will be discussing what an undergraduate learning assistant program looks like, how it's been developed over the past decade, and how this really could be the perfect testing ground for inclusive instructor practices. Second, I'll describe the fellowship I alluded to and how we taught LA's inclusive practices and the results of that fellowship. And I put teach in quotations because we learned early on that it wasn't so much about teaching them things, it was really giving LAs the space to develop and practice impactful practices within their contexts. And then lastly, I'll discuss where we go from here in both the research and the future development of learning assistant trainers.
Stepping on you, I just bumped you.
So with that, I think I'll pass it off to Dr. Stacy Sparks.
Dr. Sparks, you're muted.
Thank you, Meg.
How about that? There we go. It's always good to start the talk that way. So thank you. I'm so glad y'all are here, and I'm excited to tell you a little bit about our program. And as Eric said, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about our courses and our LA program. And if you start looking at learning assistance programs, they actually vary even within UT. They're dramatically different in biology and physics and all these other departments. So I'm really telling you specifically about our program here. Chemistry courses at UT, big courses, 300 to 500 Gen Chem students, usually a professor, a couple grad TAs, and lots of students need chemistry. So we have 9 sections of these per semester, so lots of students. And years ago, UT had a course transformation program where they provided funding with the goal of increasing retention and providing academic support for these students in these large gateway courses. So chemistry had a course transformation team that really worked on these general chemistry courses. And one of the things they wanted to do was to add active learning into the courses, but that's problematic. When you just have a teaching team of 3 and you've got 500 students, it's really hard to then reach all the students. And we really want to reach them right during the class for those same reasons that Eric mentioned, that oftentimes the students who need the help the most are not the ones who show up at office hours and help sessions. So out of that course transformation program grew our learning assistant program, and it has grown a lot. It is now about 80 learning assistants per semester. We have them in many different courses, but we're going to focus in on these general chemistry courses. That's where this fellowship that Eric's talking about, that's where we did this. And you'll notice the 2 blue circles, and I highlighted that because we have kind of 2 flavors of general chemistry. Some of us team, and so we team teach, and we focused in, we did the fellowship across all the general chemistry courses here, but we focused our statistics on those team courses because we had a lot of control and could make sure that students got all the surveys and everything we needed. So I wanted to tell you briefly just what that part looks like. There's 3 of us that team teach. We've got 6 sections across us. And for the semester that we ran the pilot program of this fellowship, we had 48 learning assistants who helped in these courses. All right, so we have this learning assistant program. What do they do? Well, pre-COVID, it looked something like this. We had this big lecture hall. We would have these activities and questions, and the professors and LAs and TAs would all walk around and answer student questions. But like everything else, COVID turned that on its side, and we moved to Zoom, we moved online. And as we did that, we started using part of our class time for Zoom discussion sessions. We broke the students into small groups of 7-ish that stayed consistent through the whole semester. We were hoping they would actually get to know people, right, during this COVID online semester. And we assigned the LAs each their own groups. So they met with the same, say, 3 groups of students every week all semester, and they would pop in and out of those breakout rooms during the session. And this opened up a lot of opportunities because suddenly the LAs really had the opportunity to get to know the students much more so than in the big lecture hall. And so that's really interesting. Okay, so that's what the LAs do. A little bit about our application process and just how we like to have a good LA program. We've got to recruit good LAs, or students with potential to be good LAs, and then we need to train them. So as we think about recruitment, we recruit from our 302 classes. So most of our LAs are sophomores. So 302 is our 2nd semester Gen Chem course. Most LAs stay for 2 semesters, so we get them for a full year. As part of the application process, and I'd say we get 150 to 200 applications every semester for those 80 spots, I asked them, well, why do you want to be in LA? And I wanted to share a couple of those quotes with you. So my LA created a safe space where we were able to ask questions. I would like to do the same for other students. And if I was in the chemistry LA program, I would be able to help and encourage students just as I had been helped and encouraged my freshman year. Now, it's an application, and they're probably a little bit telling me what they think I want to hear, but I see this over and over and over again where they reference how helpful, how encouraging, how welcoming their LA was, and they want to pass that on. And that kind of brings us back to that idea that, you know what, beyond direct academic support, there's a lot of advantages to having these LAs in our courses, right? They're close to students' concerns and experiences, so they're really approachable. They have hindsight that challenges can be overcome and improved on, like, oh yeah, that was really hard. It gets better. You can do it. They provide a role model for what college success looks like. And along with that, they increase the diversity of our teaching team. When we add the LAs to our teaching team, now our teaching team much more reflects the diversity of our classroom. Okay, so we recruit the LAs, we select our LAs, and then to make this all work, we train the LAs. And our training course, it looks a lot like this. We use the great active learning rooms over in Welch, and we spend almost all of our time in groups discussing things. It started off early on with just content review, just making sure, like, hey, do you remember this? Do you know how to do it? With an eye towards transitioning to the teaching role. Hey, what questions will you ask? How could you help a student? But we've really grown the course out, and we now do a lot of professional development, pedagogy, communications, leadership, ethics, and it's split 50-50. We've got 2 hours a week, so we spend half on content, half on professional development. So I wanted to tell you, so a few semesters ago, spring semester, so I've had these LAs already for a whole semester and part of a new one, and it just didn't feel like it was going well. Like, I don't know what it was. It just didn't feel off. It wasn't nearly as good. This is usually a fun class to teach, and it didn't seem that great. So right before spring break, I said, you know what, take out a piece of paper and tell me what's the best thing about this class. And, what's the worst thing, or what else do you want to learn? What else do you want to do? And I wanted to share a few of those quotes with you. So when I ask them, what's the best thing about the course? I hear a lot that, hey, I really understand chemistry better. That's not a surprise to anybody who's taught, right? You really understand it after you've taught it. I hear a lot about communication skills, teamwork skills. This last one was really interesting to me. The best thing about this program is really getting to know the other students and professors. I felt very isolated before this class. Two things were interesting about this. One, this is the second semester of their sophomore year. And two, I'd say 80% of the students say this. This is the best thing about the class. They really get to know other students and professors. They don't all say that they feel very isolated, but when we think about it and you think about the kind of mindset of incoming freshmen, you feel like you're going to come to college. College is the best experience ever. You're going to have this great group of friends, right? And I think sometimes we discount that it can take a while to find your group. And in a place as large as UT, I don't think this is something to dismiss, that creating communities for students and helping them find people they like hanging out with and working with. All right. So what did they want to learn more about? And this is an ongoing question I ask like every semester. They want to know more about how to teach. They want to know more about how to facilitate discussion. As we moved online, they definitely wanted to know about building community online. They wanted to know about effective online teaching methods. And y'all, they want to know more about everything. Like seriously, they are eager to learn. They want to know more about making sure students are comfortable, dealing with complaints. And I get them for 2 hours a week, right? So just those 2 hours. So things always get pushed out. I can't do all of this in those 2 hours a week. And so then when I started thinking about what's getting pushed out, especially while I was doing that TxMI fellowship last year, you know what? Oftentimes it's kind of those kind of social, emotional, soft skills, like how do you help students feel comfortable and how do you build this community, like helping them with practical things that they could do. And this really feeds in then to what Eric was talking about in this idea of changing classroom instruction. So maybe it's hard to get professors to do it, but the LAs are eager to learn. And maybe if we can add some time in where we focus specifically on those types of skills, we could make a difference. All right, and so with that, I am going to toss it back to Eric to tell you about that fellowship he developed.
Thank you, Stacy. Let me share my screen here. So as Stacy mentioned, this LA program really seemed to be a great testing ground for, where we can affect change in our classes. But we haven't yet discussed this question of how can this actually be studied using experimental methods. And so what we did was we invited LAs to be part of the supplemental fellowship to build out inclusive practices. And to give you a sense of this, this is the email we sent out to LAs inviting them to join and really highlighting the importance that they could have in students' lives. And this seemed to really work in terms of the LAs were really interested in learning more about how to become effective teachers and how to support their students. So of the 48 team taught LAs that we sent this message to, 44 of them expressed interest in it. Now we also incentivized being part of the fellowship because we gave them a few extra $100 to kind of thank them for their time. And of these 44 that expressed interest, 38 were available during the time that we had set for this additional training. And from this set, we were actually able to randomize LAs to either receive the fellowship or not. And our control group here is our LAs who are still receiving the 2 days of training in Stacy's class, but not receiving this additional fellowship where they really focus on these inclusive practices. And for those who are paying attention, the reason we ran with the 38 rather than the 48 is because assume that some of these LAs, as we found, would say, no, they weren't that interested or didn't have the time to meet. And so we didn't want to waste statistical power on LAs who weren't in that bucket and really focused on these 38 who were interested and available. And what was great and unique about this semester was that usually students chose which sections they would be a part of based on the time or the LA or other factors. But in this term, because of COVID, students were all randomly assigned 2 sections, which meant this is like the ideal experimental setup for an RCT where we would randomly assign LAs to conditions, and then students were randomly assigned to those LAs in turn. So we now have a population to work with and a way to experimentally test these things, because if we find changes based on the fellowship, LAs involved in the fellowship, we have confidence that there's something changing there that's kind of meaningful and kind of gold standard of experimental design. But we haven't yet addressed these 2 other questions. Can we motivate these instructors to change their practices and develop things, kind of do novel things in their classrooms? And how can we actually get them to use high impact practices with fidelity? And we attempt to address both these questions in a few ways. So first, we really positioned LAs as experts of their setting. So these are students who had recently taken the course. As Stacy said, they know students' concerns. They know when the most challenging material is coming up. So we really leaned on them to figure out what practices will work best for their students. In addition, we really prioritized small group discussions over lessons. So, throughout the fellowship, the most consistent feedback we got was, yes, what you're teaching us about different practices we could be doing in our sections is really helpful, but what's been most helpful is just talking to other LAs, hearing about their challenges, seeing what they've done in their sections, and figuring out how we can adapt it for ours. So what this fellowship really ended up being was we provided them a framework of how to understand how they can impact their students, gave them a few example practices, and then really step back, let them take it from there. And part of the reason this was quite practical, so our expertise is really in lead instructor practices, and LAs in this setting were quite constrained in what they could do. They had 1 hour with students, but actually 3 breakout sections within that hour, and so they only had 20 minutes with any group of students. And during this time, students were responsible for completing worksheets and actually learning the material. And so they really in practice had a few minutes to interact with their students on this other level and convey things beyond just providing support on the questions that students had on the material itself. And when I say provided a framework, you can imagine what we could have taught to LAs. Based on decades of research from psychology and education, we would have hundreds or potentially even thousands of things we could have focused on. So we could have taught them about growth mindset and how to afford students growth mindsets in their discussion sections. We could have taught them about social belonging and how to give messages that concerns about belonging are transitory and normative. We could have really focused on how to provide great feedback and supportive feedback that gets them motivated to learn more rather than demotivated. But this is among hundreds of things we could have taught them. And for a novice instructor, this can be overwhelming to say the least. How do you select the few things and use them effectively? How can you expect them to kind of become experts in all of these things and all these potential practices and choose them within just one semester. So we really tried to simplify this space in the fellowship and asked LAs to address students' two main concerns: ability and belonging. So first, we asked them to convey what we call inspiring expectations. That is explicitly giving the message that I expect a lot from you because I believe in your potential. And importantly, we clarified that although all LAs, might already believe in students' potential and know students can be successful there, it's really critical, importantly, that you say it explicitly and do other things and activities to back that up, so students really resonate with that message and understand that you believe in them. Next, we asked them to focus on what we call broad regard, really showing I care about you as a person and see you as more than just a student. That is recognizing students have lives outside the class. They have values, they have interests, family, friends, and encouraging them to bring their full selves into the classroom so they can feel connected to their peers and feel that they can authentically belong in that space. So this is the framework we provide to LAs, along with a few example practices that they could adapt along these two dimensions. And lastly, we just want to give them a higher purpose. Now, of course, LAs wanted to develop as instructors and support their students, but we also we framed the entire fellowship really with an eye towards propagating these practices to future LAs. So we kind of shifted it in, not just kind of what you can do to benefit your students, but what could you teach future LAs about how to benefit their students? And one of the things we asked them to do was create resources that could be value to future LAs in supporting their students. So, for example, we had LAs break out into different groups, and one group of LAs really focused on how do you address mistakes in discussion section at a time when students might feel particularly worried about how others would view them based on making that mistake. Another group of LAs focused on how to initially create norms that got students comfortable talking and learning from each other during discussion sections. What do you do that first discussion section to set those norms? And yet another group really focusing on some of the particular concerns student might have when entering discussion sections. So for example, a student feeling behind compared to their peers, or a fear of speaking up in class, and gave example wording about how future LAs can start to address those concerns. So next, we really asked students to, some of these groups to present what they discovered to their peers and instructors across the College of Natural Sciences. Again, really setting them up as experts with something valuable to share that other instructors can learn from. And I want to show you a short clip from the showcase to give you a sense of what LAs came up with and the nuance and consideration they put into these resources. And I hope I've clicked the right buttons. Let's see if this works. Let me know if you can't hear anything.
So students often make really small errors in discussions, and as both mentors and educators, it's really important that we take the proper steps to address that mistake while teaching and continuing to build the confidence of our students and making sure that we don't make them feel judged or afraid to ask questions. So we were able to identify 3 important roles during discussions that LAs and TAs must satisfy in order to succeed in aiding students when they make mistakes. So they need to be able to continue to facilitate an engaging discussion regarding course material. They need to allow students a space to comfortably communicate their thoughts and openly learn from their mistakes. And they need to convey inspiring expectations by giving students positive reinforcement and encouragement. So we all know speaking up in class is a very difficult task, and it's really important that we support our students when they choose to do so. So with that being said, the handout that we've created serves as a springboard for new LAs to base their future discussions on. It contains information in a problem and solution format based on all of our previous experiences, so that as LAs, we can work on mitigating any of these potential issues before they start to manifest.
Another potential issue is that students may want to be seen as competent and pretend that they know the content, especially in front of their peers. This is also known as imposter syndrome. And when they make a mistake, the feeling is especially awful because now they feel that they have been exposed and they can't mess up ever again, right? So one thing that we can do as an LA is just to tell them they're on the right track. If they are on, most of the time they will do something right. So just emphasize that, and that really helps build their confidence, and it shows that you believe in them and you want to try to figure out their thinking, of course. Another thing you could do is lead a discussion on struggles. So, preferably it would be a personal struggle, because that probably will get the students to open up the most, right? And the best way to get students to open up is just for you to open up, right? Now, if that is too personal, you could always do struggles when it comes to problems, what problems did you find the most difficult? And if like the imposter syndrome is really like interfering with that ability as well, right? The students might not want to admit that anything is difficult. Another trick that I learned from a professor is just asking like which problem took you the longest to do. And that's usually a good way of figuring out which problem is the most difficult in turn.
So this just gives you just a quick sense of some of the things that LA's developed. And I really like what this last LA said, because they talked not only about kind of a primary practice that a future LA could use, but also gave them additional ways that they could adapt it, particularly using something that they'd seen from a prior instructor. And I've now described just a bit about what this fellowship looked like, but we still don't address how this fellowship actually impacted LAs and their students. Before I get into the results, I want to take a quick detour to describe the stats that we used and pre-registered for this work, which were Bayesian causal force models. And you might ask, what is that? Well, in one sentence, here's my best description. It's a machine learning algorithm that allows multiple moderators and covariates to interact in complex ways without overfitting. And you don't need to know what that means, but what I do want to convey is that there are some advantages of using DCF. First, it's really good at finding true effects. And in head-to-head competition, it outperforms many other types of models that we could have used to figure out whether we're finding true effects in our data. Yet it's also quite conservative, with a prior belief of small intervention effects with little chance of moderation, and in doing so prevents false positives. What this means is that if we find promising effects in the model, we have more confidence that we found something real rather than overinterpreting noise in our data. And what this means for the results I'll be presenting today is that I'm going to report average treatment effects for the fellowship in standard deviations of the outcome variables I'm discussing, as well as a 90% posterior density interval. And to orient you to the graphs, really as a rule of thumb, if you see boxes, these are going to be box plots. So if you see interquartile boxes that are not overlapping with one another, that's kind of a good rule of thumb that those are meaningful differences across groups. So it's the end of the detour. Let's get to the results. So the first question we had was, did LA students benefit from them being part of this fellowship? Did something propagate down to students based on the fellowship, what we did in the fellowship? And we first found promising evidence that we're onto something real when we looked at the midterm student surveys and saw some of the glowing reviews that LAs in the fellowship had received from their students. So for example, one student wrote, "My LA is so easy to talk to. I never feel intimidated about asking a question, even if it feels like a stupid question." Another student writes, "I usually feel quite the opposite, but my LA always helps me feel seen and heard." And yet another student, "My LA is very encouraging and clearly cares about all of us, which actually helps us learn." Now, of course, this is only a handful of responses from hundreds of students. So we surveyed students at the end of the term as well about their experiences in discussion section, focusing on their comfort and motivation. So for example, we asked them, how often did you feel motivated to do your best work? How often did you feel connected to other students? And what we found was, in my mind, pretty extraordinary results. So these are box plots of the posterior distribution for the scale for both the fellowship and what I'm calling the business as usual control group, which is LAs who were already taking Stacy's LA training class. And as I mentioned before, a good rule of thumb is this a meaningful difference if these boxes aren't touching? And so what you see here is quite a nice effect. And this is the first causal evidence that an inclusive teaching training program like this can benefit students' motivation and connection in the classroom. And although we haven't received demographic data for all the students that sample, at a first pass, it sure looks like Black, Latinx, Pacific Islander, Native American students are really driving this effect. So for these students with LAs who are part of the fellowship, they had effects about 2.5 times larger than their white and Asian American peers. So what changed? What did LAs actually do differently in the classroom and the discussion sections that students picked up on? Again, we really had LAs focus on conveying these two pieces of inspiring expectations and broad regard. And we asked students items at the end of the term, within the last month or so, how often did your LA say or do something that communicated they believe in every student's potential to learn and improve? Or for broad regard, for example, how often did they say or do something that encouraged students to share things about their lives beyond academics? What we found was some evidence of an impact of being part of the fellowship on students' reports of LA's inspiring expectations, but we seem to find a larger effect on these reports of broad regard. And one reason for this might be that in Stacy's class, they're already discussing things really about showing students that you believe in them and kind of ensuring that students feel like they're capable of learning material. And I think this broad regard piece is a little bit more unique. It's one of those kind of soft skills that Stacy had alluded to that students in LAs weren't really getting without this fellowship. And this is where we're really finding the biggest driver. I also want to mention that Stacy suggested this idea that many LAs in her training class really felt like this was a great way to get to know their peers and instructors and feel connected to others at UT. And we thought maybe by providing LAs this additional opportunity to interact with their peers and build better connections with their students, they might even report greater belonging than kind of the business as usual condition. So we asked 2 questions to get at this at the end of the term. And again, these were LA report. So I felt confident that I belong at UT. And then when thinking about UT, how often, if ever, did you wonder, maybe I don't belong here, reverse COVID? And what we find is promising evidence that LAs are benefiting from being in the fellowship. And importantly, these types of belonging items have shown to track with academic success and retention, really suggesting a potential long-term benefit for LAs that we definitely want to follow up on. And on that point, the results I presented thus far are really promising, but only within 1 term. And we're not quite sure yet how this plays out in the long term. And I think the first question is, will these ideas and practices that LA's developed, will they propagate? The ideal LA training program would be somewhere where they develop promising practices and then pass them down to future LAs, which become the norm. And we find some suggestive evidence that students of LAs in the fellowship are more likely to be selected to become LAs the next year. And what this means is that there's some signal in those applications that LA applications that Stacy talked about and that the other lead instructors picked up on that suggests that these are students that care about the students that will be really successful LAs. And this idea provides an opportunity for those future LAs to remember what their LAs did, who are in the fellowship, and use some of those practices they experienced with their students, again, propagating these practices into the future. In addition, we really want to investigate whether this leads to greater persistence in the major and success in the next gateway course. For many students, this is organic chemistry. Because wouldn't it be really great if students of LAs in the fellowship felt like they could belong and succeed a little bit more in that space? They got to know a few more students in their discussion group, were more comfortable turning to them for help and forming study groups, and could connect with those same students again in organic chemistry. This seems like this type of cycle could really start a positive recursive cycle of increasing retention for students. And so we definitely want to follow up with this current cohort. We're continuing to randomize new cohorts of LAs each term, and hopefully expanding to other classes as well. And we really want to see if we can capture some of these potential long-term effects. So to sum up kind of what we hope you take away from this talk, first, learning assistants can improve students' college experience, and LAs in the program can benefit as well. We've hopefully convinced you that the LH program is worthwhile and can start to positively shift students' experiences in the course. In addition, this is really some of the first causal evidence that inclusive instructor practices support student motivation and comfort. Of course, this is only a first study, but it provides a roadmap for how to conduct rigorous research on instructor practice in the future. And it really sets the foundation for a fellowship that could be replicated and spread to other large gateway STEM courses. In part because our fellowship was kind of agnostic to the course in many ways. We depend on LAs to develop practices that work for their context. And so we can imagine incorporating lots of LAs across lots of different courses, maybe even institutions. And as long as they had a few peers, a few LA peers teaching the same course, they could go off and adapt it in ways that make sense for their students. So with that, I want to keep some time for questions at the end here. So I'll stop and just say thank you to Stacy in particular. It's been wonderful collaborating with you. but to all our collaborators on this work, to all our funders and supporting institutions, and thank you all for being here. And I put our contact information below. We might not get the chance to get all questions answered, but so feel free to reach out after the talk. And with that, I think I'll turn to questions. Thank you. So to start off, I can maybe moderate some of the questions we received in the chat. And Cameron, I see your hand. I can get you soon. So Michael Marr asks, since race and ethnicity are so tightly correlated with economic means, could it be that economic resources and not belonging are the main drivers? And I mean, yes, of course, economic kind of resources are going to impact students' experiences. And if I showed you that same graph by SES rather than race, you'd see very similar kind of dips in retention based on, for example, first generation status or not. And we don't have the precise data on these students to really piece that apart, I think, in this study. But I mean, it's certainly something we can't ignore. And I think something to look into is, trying to piece apart further, once we get full demographics data from these students, if students who maybe are struggling financially, that this fellowship might not be enough to kind of change their experience in the class. And I guess I'm curious, Stacy, if you have thoughts on that piece as well.
Well, I was curious when I was looking at that. So that first graph you have with where we know we controlled for test scores. I mean, do you know from that data, did they control for any sort of social economic type thing? Because that would be really interesting. I think to Michael's point, does that overwhelm the racial gaps or not?
For the data we have from that, and that, to be truthful, I hadn't run that specific data. I pulled that from our lab, so I couldn't speak directly to it. But I don't think we're able to piece apart from that. But it's definitely an interesting question. If we have that, we should look into that. I suspect that you would still see the disparities even when controlling for economic means as well. And I would put my money on that. And then
Michael, you said you had something about you teach.
Yeah. So I've been looking back at the general program elements from the Learning Assistant Alliance. And I remember that when Colorado was in the first cohort of UTeach programs, one of the reasons they were really interested in joining UTeach is that they thought that the LA program would be a great way to recruit for teaching. And they've actually made that one of the features of the Learning Assistant program. So I think maybe the main thing is that I just need to talk to all of our recruitment people within UTeach, because I think we're not taking advantage of this fully. We haven't been recruiting enough with this population of students, because that huge list of things you said they wanted to know more about, well, one way to learn more about them is to join UTeach.
Yeah, we should talk about that, because they often want to, the LAs will often ask me if they can stay in the program another year. Like, they want to keep going, but if I do that, I don't have room for new students to get the experience, right? So I always turn it over. UTeach might be a great, do something slightly different. So anyway, you and I should talk. That would be great.
Well, it's not just doing something slightly different, it's changing your life trajectory, but
no, but to continue using the teaching skills and learn, I guess what I was going for, learning more new teaching skills and more new skills. Yes. So I didn't mean to dismiss that, but I think it would be a great recruitment.
nothing to say, but agreed. That'd be wonderful. And Michael, I see you had a few other questions. I'm going to actually jump over to Deborah Hansen. Says you present questions posted about the discussion sections, but do you ask any survey questions about students' experience of the class overall that suggest the LA program affected the lecture experience as well as the discussion section? So we really focused on students' experiences in the discussion section because we thought that's would be where we had the most movement. We also collected items about the course overall and kind of feelings of belonging in the course and things of that sort. But even at the baseline, like the baseline, we didn't actually pre-register that we'd find effects on those because we thought it would be kind of unlikely that this would transition into my feeling of belonging across like this giant chemistry course, and the kind of more immediate environment where students are really getting that synchronous experience would be in discussion sections. So
Plus, Eric, can I jump in? This pilot program, so where Eric's presenting the data from, was also during our COVID year. And so our class was really pretty much just discussion sessions for the part where we met with students. We did pre-recorded videos, and then we had office hours. We had other things, but largely there wasn't a class in the way there is in a normal semester. So I think that's an excellent point, though, that as now we're transitioning back and figuring out what pieces of each thing to keep, that those questions would be really good.
So it really was essentially flipped for them. They would learn all of this stuff and then come and discuss it with their TAs, with their 1LA, sorry.
With their LAs, yeah. And then the TAs and professors would also like pop in and out of discussion groups and chat, but they're really, I mean, the LAs were their closest point of contact, right? Those are the people they saw every time. So yes, definitely a flipped course during COVID.
and then Cameron, I saw you had your hand raised before. Do you still have a question, or has it been addressed?
Yeah, I do. And also that was just a really fabulous talk. The research is incredible, and it's just awesome to see that you had those kind of effects both on the students and the LA's experiences. It's really exciting. So the one thing I was wondering about is you talked about how this provides kind of a good model or a good opportunity to learn about what kinds of teaching practices can have positive causal effects. And that got me thinking about what other ways that you could explore the data that you collected, not so much on the causal end, as you could learn about teaching practices. And noticed you gave the ULAs a couple of things to focus on, but had them kind of create their own materials. And it seemed like their materials and their practices that they created to communicate to other LAs in the future probably had some meaningful variability in them in terms of what they focused on. So I'm wondering if you have or have considered doing any like coding of that kind of into like different categories of types of practices the LAs focused on, to see if maybe you could get a little bit of leverage on which types of practices were the most effective.
So that's a really interesting idea. And I think the first thing to state is, we only had, 18 of these fellows initially, and they grouped up into groups of 3 or 4. So we're really now talking about, 5 groups, 6 groups, actually, I think, that we can actually kind of piece that apart of what they focus on and whether we see different effects for them. So I just don't think we're really powered to do that. But, I think it'd be fascinating in future terms to actually get different groups of LAs to focus on different practices for that week. And then we can get some sort of immediate survey or kind of some behavioral measure of how much students are engaging in discussion sections, maybe like how much they speak during those discussion sections, where we can actually see, okay, this practice at the beginning of the discussion section led more students to talk. Like, that would be amazing. I think that'd be ideal, kind of one of the next studies. We have many ideas of what to do next, but that'd be kind of a definitely next step of really trying to get a little bit more precise measure of what exactly were the things that were most effective. And we're really excited about kind of that piece. So I'll jump back. I think Michael Meyer had another question up here. No, that was just elaboration of the last point. Unless you had something else to say, Michael, I'd love to hear from you.
Well, there is a default pedagogy course, which is the one that's in the general program elements and propagated by Colorado. So it would seem to me that what's being proposed here is either a modification, well, probably a modification of one of the elements of that. And so it would be really interesting to connect with that community and propose this as a systematic change to be implemented nationally, because there's a mechanism for that.
Yeah, and I think Stacy would agree that I think there's lots of elements from other programs and training modules and things like that that we could probably pull into both the course and the fellowship. And I think more systematically thinking through, again, like there's so many things we could teach them, and we really need some sort of simplified way to do that. And if we're talking about meeting just for 1 hour every 10 weeks, we really need to hone on what we think is most impactful. And I think in many ways, I feel like we did that pretty effectively compared to other trainings that I've looked at least online, and other kind of pieces that we could have just provided LAs. But I mean, certainly to explore further.
Michael, are you thinking that, assuming that, we've really just had that pilot program. So now that we've kind of seen where the promising things are, we want to like flesh that out and continue it. But so you're thinking though that a great way to disseminate this idea would be to connect with the people, because as you pointed out, the Colorado LA program is kind of the standard there. Connect with them and talk to them about how that might be implemented in addition to some of their materials or guidelines kind of.
Well, I mean, they came up with the idea, and they're the ones responsible for having spread it around the country and around the world. And they've established the standard model for this that places use, although there are lots of variations. So the logical thing to do is already the evidence looks fantastic. And I think it would certainly be, of great interest to them. I bet Noah Finkelstein and Valerie Otero and all the other people would love to know about this. But I mean, I don't think there's an infinite space for things that can be done. There is a default space, which is what they refined over the years. So making a change in that, I think, is, it's an important addition to a pretty large national project.
Yeah, and I actually got connected to that crew a few months back and talked to them and just talked through, especially as we're thinking through this term and what we might change and improve in the fellowship. But I definitely think it's worthwhile looping back and seeing kind of how we actually could, again, co-develop things, build these out, and really spread these ideas. I think that's great.
Other questions, other things that y'all thought of while we were talking or that we didn't explain well? I don't see anything else in the chat. So we appreciate y'all showing up. Oh, Michael, go for it.
Yeah, isn't it the vaccine celebration now?
It is the vaccine celebration right now.
So just saying, vaccine celebration right now.
4 to 6:30, is that right? 4:30 to 6:30, so it just started. So for those of you on the UT campus, if you're logging in somewhere else, that's not going to be really fun for you. But
I know it was a thing, but it sounds wonderful.
Yes, there is a big celebration of the creation of the COVID vaccine happening with pop-up vaccine clinic and all sorts of stuff.
Wonderful. Well, that, we'll stick around for a few more minutes, but thank you all so much for attending. Again, please follow up if you're interested in learning more or want to chat, and really appreciate your time. So thank you.
Yes, thank you all so much. We do appreciate you being here.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Yes, thank you, Matthew, for recording and organizing all this and the Zoom link and everything.
Yes. And Michael, thank you for all the questions.
Yes, thank you.
Well, it's
And
great
I
work.
would like to talk to you about You Teach, because I feel like these students develop this love of teaching, but then I just end it. I would love for them to, maybe get more interested in it as like a career and moving in that way.
Well, I just wrote the recruitment team that we should be targeting all the LA seminars. And I can't believe that we haven't been doing it already.
No,
We
that
don't
would,
have the classes, but we should be targeting the LA seminars and provide chance for people to ask questions.
I think that would be amazing. So we'll talk. Do you recruit mainly in the spring
No,
for the following year? No, you recruit for every semester?
every semester.
Ah, excellent. All right, well, let me know and we will get that in there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Stacy.
No problem.
Bye.
Thank y'all.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Stacy.